Good morning. This is part 1, chapter 5, The Genes of Gregoria. June 2nd, 1988. Dear David, first let me say how nice it was to talk to you on the telephone. Luba was very moved by your response, and the first thing that she asked me was, what did he say about his health? Embarrassed, I had to admit that in the excitement, I had forgotten to ask. Please tell us in your next letter. Luba is still enthusiastic about our project, but I detect an added tension in her voice when I told her of the university's offer to publish it. I hope that you can understand, David. It is all meaningless to the present generation, but among the older Soviet people, there are still the memories. We had a terrible word for the women who fraternized with the Nazis. The word was svinoik. It means pig, but we all remember that it meant a lot more than that. I hated to hear the word even used because many times those who never had to make the choice to live or die were the ones using it. All over Europe, there are those who chose to survive, and as long as they did not give the enemy military aid or help them to win the war, I made no judgments. Luba was a victim and a great patriot. She needs no defense from me, but I was only trying to point out why she is so nervous. I also feel a strange tension, because I must always be careful about giving the proper historical background so that you can project yourself into the family here and understand our decisions. Our grandfather, Gregoria Ivanovich Truskoff, was stunned when Lenin capitulated to the Germans in March of 1918. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was a very hard one, forced on a new government by a militarily superior German nation. Lenin summed it up this way: Germany is only pregnant with socialist revolution, and a quite healthy child has already been born unto us. It is a socialist republic, which we may kill if we continue the war. Perhaps he knew that such a treaty would only last until the Allies defeated the Germans, which they did in just 8 months after the treaty was signed. And Lenin had to concentrate on how to deal with the Western Allies. That was his primary concern. I don't wish to start quoting from my grammar school textbooks, David, but it is important that you see the Byelorussia that our grandfather Gregoria was looking at in 1918. To him, Byelorussia was the center of the world, and from there he viewed the international tornado swirling around his home. The Germans thought that they could expand their empire to include all of Russia, and in March they set up a government, albeit a very shaky one, under Skoropadsky in the Ukraine. After the armistice and the German pullout, anarchy prevailed. Various groups fought for control, and Kiev, the capital, changed hands many times. Most of the warring groups, who had outside support, were very ruthless and used the poison propaganda that Hitler was later to adopt. The lumping together of the Bolsheviks and the Jews. They used the old church-created anti-Semitism for their attacks against the socialists and anyone else who opposed them. It was not a tactic that would die easily, and millions of Jews lost their lives in the madness that was to follow. Now, David, if you were Gregoria, living on a farm just outside of Pinsk, and you were a literate and well-informed man, how would you view the situation? Our grandfather had many decisions being made for him. When the German Empire collapsed in 1918, a Polish Republic was proclaimed in Warsaw. Its leader was Pilsudski, who had the idea of taking advantage of the weakness of both the German and the Soviet military forces and creating a Polish empire. His plan was to make Lithuania, Byelorussia, and Ukraine all into a Polish federation. He had the full support of the Roman Catholic Church and the Western powers, who saw in him another opportunity to defeat the Bolsheviks and regain the rich resources of the area. With very poor planning, Pilsudski sent his troops into what he thought were defenseless lands. He was soon driven all the way back to Warsaw, but the Western powers would not give up that easily. Lenin could not afford to fight another outside war. He already had the British, hired killer, the Hitler before his time, Admiral Kolchak, and others invading his country to the north. It was their intention to destroy the new baby before it grew too strong. Lenin decided to pacify the West, but for Gregoria, Lenin's decision was a catastrophe. His beloved Byelorussia was cut in half, and the family farm was in the section deeded to Poland. You see, David, how easy your grammar school history lessons were compared to mine. Can you imagine the complicated problems the Curzon line that divided us created for my family? Gregoria was a Bolshevik at heart, a Belarusian, who thought of himself as a socialist citizen, and his land had just been given to the Polish government. The Polish occupation was very oppressive. My father, Nikolaya, of course, had to flee, and was not able to return for many years. He helped other intellectuals who were sent into the area to reach the illiterate to escape. After the first ruthless Polish purges, things began to settle down, because Gregoria's farm and soap and candle factory employed many workers, and both were very productive. He was able to maintain a certain status, he admitted. His thin relationship with the church, even though it was not the Roman Catholic Church, helped him to retain his holdings during the Polish occupation. He paid his taxes, exacted by the Poles, and continued to run the farm and factory. He also continued to anger the bureaucrats by speaking the Belarusian language that had been banned by the Poles. He was tolerated, and even the Jews who worked for him were able to survive. The West and the Polish government were trying to sell a message to the rest of the world that the people in the occupied area of Byelorussia were much better off than they would have been under the Bolsheviks. Grandfather was able to take advantage of that. He was so well known that arresting him might have set off a local uprising. He remained free and was able to send financial and material support to his son and his son's cause. Now, right here in our history is where you have a chance to grasp the heart of the Soviet motivation, the pilot light for most of our political actions. My father used to call the years from 1936 to 1939 the years that the Great Bear awakened from a winter's sleep that lasted 900 years. Sons and daughters of the proletariat were graduating from the universities, and illiteracy was being conquered in the land. Stalin hurried to indoctrinate the newly educated Soviets. He knew the time was short. He also knew that in the occupied area of Byelorussia, the Poles and the West were also trying to capture the minds of the people. Nikolaya was called on to distribute speeches such as the one given by Michael Kalinin, who at the time was the chairman of the Central Executive Committee of the Soviet Union. Kalinin said, "Our state is socialist, but it is surrounded by the capitalist states whose ruling classes are itching to destroy the bulwark of socialism in this world. Everything possible is being done to damage the work of socialist construction. Russia, a world by itself, was becoming the Soviet Union, a world by itself, surrounded by enemies. Joseph Stalin hammered away at the minds of young Soviets with his encirclement message. In a much-publicized speech in March of 1937, Stalin told his people, 'The Soviet Union is in a state of encirclement. Capitalist encirclement means that here is one country, the Soviet Union, that has established within its borders a socialist order. And outside there are many bourgeois countries which continue to carry on the capitalist mode of life and surround our Soviet Union. They are waiting for an opportunity to attack it, to break it, or at any rate to undermine the power and to weaken it. It is precisely that fact which determines the basis of the relationship between the capitalist encirclers and the Soviet Union.' David, as I write this letter on June 2nd, 1988, your president is in Moscow. If Stalin were alive today, he would tell him the very same thing in the very same way, because that aspect of our relationship has not changed at all. We see only the change in tactics. Today we are still encircled by your missiles, but let us go back to the family history. On the first day of September 1939, the Red Army marched into the Polish sector of Byelorussia and moved the Soviet border all the way back to Litovsk. Gregoria was ecstatic over the event. His land had once again been placed on Soviet soil. It would, he thought, be collectivized before the next harvest. After almost 20 years, he was again a Soviet citizen, and his son could come home without the fear of arrest. It was a time to rejoice, but the celebration was tempered. The bitterness left by the harsh treatment of the Belarusians at the hands of the Polish overseers was not to be erased easily. Many Poles, whom were thought of as brothers, were rounded up and sent to labor camps in the interior. My father said that they would be better off there than they would be under the Nazis. He was right about that. It was, as I am sure you can imagine, very difficult for me to understand then. History has shown that the Poles interned were, of course, much better off than those who faced the Nazi invasion in Poland. David, you mentioned in one of your letters that your parents could speak many languages. Well, it was normal for all of us to switch from Belarusian to Polish to Russian and back again. Gregoria and my parents could speak the Ukrainian language as well, and Yiddish. We heard all these languages on the farm every day. Gregoria and my father were pleased with the restoration of the Soviet borders. They both saw it as a military tactic and the first step toward cleansing our area of the dangerous nationalists who wanted Belarusia as an independent, church-ran state, or as my father would say, they want to send us back to slavery. Many of them fled in front of the Red Army, only to return later as the hated Nazi collaborators. All of this was far above my head at the time, and I felt very sorry for my sister Luba, who had many close Polish friends. Now, my cousin David, I know that you have an interest in history, and that I am probably telling you things that you already know. But let me add into this confusing maze of facts the human ingredient that brings it to life, and that makes me feel the pain. My father was instructed by the party to support the non-aggression pact with Hitler. Now I am sure that you can see what our dilemma was. Nikolai was giving speeches and telling the people that Germany was not our enemy, but the British and the Americans were. They were the ones trying to encircle and destroy the Soviet Union. The imperialist powers trying to maintain a fascist state in Germany will fail, and socialism will prevail there, he wrote in a pamphlet that I still remember. It was the little red book with the white hammer and sickle on it that told the novel-like saga of the assassinations in Germany of communist leaders like Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg by the fascists. Nikolai said the killing was an unsuccessful attempt to slow the rapidly growing party membership in Germany. More than 20% of the German people were communists before Hitler came into power, and the Soviet people must support them. That was the message that poor Nikolai had to sell. He never forgave himself for allowing Stalin to use him in that way. He felt that he had contributed to the attitude of the Belarusian people that was contrary to the attitude that was needed to stop the invasion. Instead of unifying, he felt that he had helped to divide an already divided people. They were simply not mentally prepared for the vicious animals in the gray uniforms with the red swastikas. My father and many others like him never did come to grips with the fact that human beings, or at least those with arms and legs and looked like human beings, could turn into such heinous monsters as the Nazi. They and their collaborators slaughtered thousands of women and children in cold blood. Nikolai and Gregoria had no illusions about the pact. They knew that sooner or later the German fascist army would be the one to spearhead the attempts to destroy the socialist state. Neither one of them believed that the Red Army propaganda pieces that Nikolai had stacked in boxes in his room. The pamphlets told of the Great Red Army's ability to stop any invader. The material was for the consumption of the general public, but many party officials had their doubts, including Nikolai and Gregoria, and they were standing right across from the most modern, best-equipped, best-trained army in the world. I am sure that they did not sleep well at night. The spring of 1941 was, I recall, a very wet one, and we did not get the gardens planted until later than usual, but there was a festive air about the farm. First we celebrated Luba's birthday, and her fiancé, the flyer Valery Germaninov Krukovsky, had at last graduated from the Air Academy, and they had to set the date for the wedding. It was to be in July, when he was expected to be home on leave and staying at the farm. I loved him. He was big and handsome and strong and very athletic. He was also the son of a farmer, and the parents of both arranged a meeting with Luba. They were very much in love. Elaborate plans were being made for a big wedding at the church in the center of Plotnica. It was a concession to the boy's parents. The women were all excited, but Nikolaya never seemed to be able to get into the spirit of it. Gregoria and his sons were both convinced that the invasion would come soon, and both were aware of the danger that we were in. They were only in doubt about where the Germans would attack. They kept hoping that the British might distract Hitler long enough for Stalin to prepare his army. The roads and the rail lines from Pinsk to Minsk seemed to be inviting to the Nazis, and they were soon to take up the invitation. Since the Red Army moved to reunite Belarusia, there were many soldiers in our area, making the population feel very secure. 2 years earlier, my father had tried to get my mother to move to Minsk. There, he explained, both Luba and I could go to the state school, and we would not have to be away from home so much. Both my mother and Natasha resisted. Natasha was in poor health, and that fact kept my father from pressing the point. Our grandmother died on a bitter cold day in February. My father was later to say that it was a blessing in disguise, because she died peacefully in her sleep. Her history was intact. The farm remained as she knew it as a child. Her family was healthy and happy. Her husband was at her side. When the spring plowing and planting was done in May of 1941, Gregoria felt that he could manage alone and suggested to Nikolaya that we go to Minsk. He got the support of Luba and my mother when he explained that he could buy things for the wedding at the many shops there, and that I could register at the state school for the next semester. Nikolaya did not tell them that he had already rented a house near the center of Minsk for the entire year, nor did he tell them that Gregoria was going to come and stay with us, leaving the farm to be run by a manager until it was collectivized. I was very excited about the trip. I had never been on a train before, although I had seen my father off a few times. I was also excited about the prospect of going to a new and much better school, far advanced over the one that I was attending. My father had an important meeting that he had to attend in Minsk in the middle of the week. Luba and Sarah were not yet ready to leave, even though they thought that they were only going for a week. It was agreed that I would go ahead with my father, and they would join us later, so he would not frighten everyone. Nikolaya bought tickets for a return trip for Luba and my mother, assuring them that they would have plenty of time when they got back to make the final wedding arrangements. I am sure that he was hoping that we would all be back for the wedding. Papa and I left on Sunday morning. We took the train from Pinsk to Birovichi, and then boarded a train that ran from Brest to Minsk. He had made the same trip many, many times. The train from Brest was already full of refugees who were telling wild tales about an invasion. They were told that the Nazis had crossed the border and that the Grodno and Brest were under air attacks by dive bombers when their train had left. My father was very agitated. It was too late to turn back, and the speeding train certainly was not going to stop. There was no way to get a message back to the farm. He kept telling me to ignore the stories. There are many spies and saboteurs among them, and their job is to create as much panic as they can. He said, poor Nikolaya, it was July 22nd, 1941, and he had no way of knowing that we were on the last civilian train from Brest for Minsk. David, I must again try and create the crackling electric air that made my breath short and rapid. It was difficult to take a full breath. There was controlled pandemonium. If that sounds like a contradiction, it is not. There were those who pretended to know what they were doing, and because you were so desperate for some kind of order and leadership, you would believe them, only to find out later that another authority had contradicted them. Instinct told many people to flee north, but then there were other things to consider. The forest hid you from the plains, and the marsh slowed their tanks. There was the fear of the dive bombers ahead and the Nazi tanks behind. Paratroopers were already blowing up bridges and blocking roads. Saboteurs Charges were tearing up rail lines. Perhaps the best way to help you feel the panic is to put it all in the time frame and then look at it. The Nazi panzers arrived in Minsk just 2 weeks after we did, and in 17 days they were well beyond Minsk and into Smolensk. To use the word chaos is not sufficient, because it describes the confusion without the pain. When our train pulled into the station at Minsk, my father took my hand and pulled me off the train. He dragged me all the way to his military headquarters. I was sweaty and panting when we arrived, and I was forced to sit in a small, stuffy room and wait for him. I kept looking out through a dirty window at the people rushing in all directions. After what seemed like hours, my father came back into the room. He was wearing his military uniform, and his face was drawn and ashen. He did not look like the same man that had boarded the train a few hours earlier. He didn't say anything. He took my arm and steered me out of the building. We walked silently to the house that he had rented. He made us both something to eat and waited until we finished before he told me the bad news, as he understood it. He started by telling me that Stalin could not divulge his plans because there were too many spies and traitors in Byelorussia. He plans to let the fascists in until their supply lines are long and Captain Winter freezes them. Then we will wipe them off our land, he said. What about Mama and Luba and Grandpa, I asked. Will they be here soon? He got up and walked to the window and stared out for a moment. Then turning quickly, he came back and took my hand. You are no longer a child. Now you must be a man. The reports from Grodno and Brest are from their own troops, who have already been bypassed by advancing Nazi panzer divisions. The trains have been bombed and strafed. Saboteurs are destroying the rail lines and the bridges. The roads are being mined. The invasion seems to be concentrating more in the south and the north in a pincer move. Perhaps they will be all right. I remember crying that night and wondering why they hadn't come with us. Grandpa had a calf that he was going to sell the next day, and Sarah had more cleaning to do before she closed up the house. It all seemed so stupid. For 2 days I spent most of my time looking out the window, wondering when I would see the rest of the family come up the stone walk. I saw my father only for short periods of time, when he would come in and check on me, something to eat, drink a little tea, fall asleep for a while. He always seemed embarrassed when he woke up about taking the time to sleep. Then he would rush back out. A woman I knew only as Nadia came in most of the time to cook for many people, and sometimes she would sit with me when I went to bed like I was a little baby. She answered only a few of my questions. On the third day, she helped me pack my things and told me to wait for my father. When he arrived, there was a soldier with him who took my things and put them on a truck. Your father was curt with me. My father was curt with me. You are going to school in Moscow. You should be very proud. I hope that you will pay attention to your lessons, because your country will need good officers very soon. I pleaded with him not to send me away. I feared that I would never see Mama or Luba again. Grandpa will bring them here soon, I said. Nikolaya was not listening. He was staring at the steps that led to the bedrooms in the large house. It was as if he could see Sarah coming down them to make breakfast. Without taking his eyes from the stairs, he said, The Soviet state is at war. You must be a man. You may not ever see them again, but perhaps they are all right. At least you know that they will always be with us. Be a man. We will keep thinking that they are all right until we know otherwise. I began to weep, and he walked over and hugged me for a moment. Then he pushed my shoulders back and told me to get into the truck, or I will miss the train. I asked him if he was going with me, and he shook his head. I am a soldier. I will go where they send me, and I will do my job. You do your job. You go and study hard. David, those moments are very sharp pictures that I have always suppressed, because even now, here in the office, half a century later, I have to fight back the tears. On the trip from Pinsk, before we heard about the war, Nikolaya had been very worried, but he was also happy about being able to rent the house in Minsk. He repeated more than once how much he thought Sarah, Luba, and Grandpa would like it. The house once belonged to the first physician to practice in Minsk. He used it as a clinic until the first hospital was built. It was constructed mostly of logs and stone, and my father knew how Sarah would love the many flower boxes that ringed the porch. The poor man expected an invasion, but he never expected the lightning-like blitzkrieg to reach Minsk in just 2 short weeks. No one did. Our driver was having difficulty maneuvering the truck through the clogged road to the train station. There were soldiers and civilians moving like drones along the way. Inside the truck, 3 of us rode in silence. Even with all the noise of the truck engine, I was sure that my father could hear my heart beating. My mind was filled with reasons to express why I should not go, but my father's grim face kept me from articulating them. At the train station, there was a mass of bouncing babushkas and a constant, high-pitched mingling of voices. Mothers were shouting and pushing, all trying to get their children onto the train before the trainmen would permit them on. My father brought me to the first car, and face to face with the man who was to be in charge of the students on that car. I shook hands with him and turned to kiss my father. He held me tight and again reminded me to be a good student. He joked about me joining me in Moscow someday and promised to write to me. He said that he would send me all the information about the family and said that they might also join me in Moscow. We both tried to smile. Once aboard the train, I rushed to the window, as all the children did. I could feel others pushing me against the window as they tried to wave to their mothers on the platform. I watched Nikolai get back into the truck. When the train lurched forward, he waved to me, and I didn't know if he could see me or not, but I waved back and kept waving as the truck pulled away and was soon lost among the crowd of people. The train stopped and stood puffing on the tracks for what seemed like an eternity, because the younger children could still see their parents waving to the trains, and some had started to cry. Nikolai was already on the road, speeding out of Minsk towards his newly formed unit, and was well out of town by the time the train started up again. With steel screeching against steel, the heavy, overcrowded train finally started to move steadily as the wheels took hold on the rails. We moved very slowly through the freight yards, and had just switched to the single rail lines that would take us out of Minsk when the dive bombers came over. I was pulled away from the window and thrown into a pile of howling children in the center of the train. I remember feeling very embarrassed about being treated like the younger children. I was almost draft age, and there were already boys my age in the military. The whine of bullets tearing through the roof brought new screams, and the loud explosions that lifted the front of the train right off the tracks sent us all sprawling to the floor. I managed to find my way to an exit, and as terrified as I was of the planes, I knew that I didn't want to stay on that train because it was the target. I jumped and ran into a field of tall grass. There I threw myself to the ground and covered my head with my arms. David, when you described all the details of your experience in the Youth Day riot, I understood how you could remember it all. Because of all the experiences that I had during the war, I remember that one the most clearly. I can hear the screams of the hundreds of children, and I can still see the mothers all running along the tracks toward the smoldering, twisted heap of metal. I remember the sick feeling I had when I peeked up and saw a bomb buckle the train right in the middle, and the rage that passed through me when the last plane, rocking its wings, sped off with the others. It had rained the night before, and the field did not drain well. I was covered with mud, but I was not hurt. I began walking towards the station. The piercing screams were now a steady, heart-wrenching sound that I could not escape. Men who were fighting the flames, coming from the station roof, gave it up and ran to help those on the train. I avoided all the commotion by walking across the rail yard and climbing a steep hill that led to the road back to my house. Once on the road, I ran all the way, thinking that my father might be there still. There were many soldiers standing in front when I had arrived, and they would not let me in. An officer came by and asked my name. He told me to wait out on the stone steps. A few minutes later, Nadia came out of the house and threw her arms around me. She had tears flowing down her red cheeks and ignored my warnings about the mud. I kept asking her if she knew where my father was and if the rest of my family had arrived. If she heard any of my questions, she did not answer. She led me into the house, and for the first time, I noticed that she was wearing an officer's uniform. The house was full of high-ranking military men. There was even a general there that evening. For most of the day, after I got myself cleaned up, I was kept in the kitchen and out of the way, while meeting after meeting took place in the other rooms. I had no other clothes to wear while mine dried, so I could not leave the kitchen if I wanted to. I sat there wrapped in a blanket, listening to what was going on in the next room and trying to get some idea of where my father was. I was a 17-year-old boy, but I soon began to understand what had happened and what was going to happen. Even as a boy, I had difficulty accepting the fact that our army was caught so unaware. Like the attack by the Japanese on Pearl Harbor, the invasion was called a sneak attack. We were as unprepared in Byelorussia as you were in the Pacific. We would have great initial losses as you had on Wake Island, Bataan, and Corregidor before we could regroup and drive the Nazi back, just as you had to do with the Japanese. I could not, and still do not, believe that our high command did not know that the attack was coming. I know that there are those in the United States who still believe that Roosevelt knew that the Japanese would attack in the Pacific. Perhaps both Stalin and Roosevelt had World War I mindsets and never expected the enormous initial damage that could then be inflicted by modern weapons. That first evening, I heard Nadia, who was Home Guard officer, talking about the evacuation of the city and the shipment of children by truck to the outskirts until they could be sent further north. I was fascinated by the conversations around me, a 17-year-old boy in the middle of the local high command at wartime. Sometimes I thought that I might wake up and hear my mother calling for me for breakfast. I suppose all armies are the same. There are the officers who fill the uniform, and then there are the real military men. The uniforms parrot the political line and act out our strategy that they were taught at school. The real military men are 2 chess steps ahead and make their moves to fit the situation. That night, there was madness in the house. The uniforms were issuing communiques to the troops in the field. We must repel the invaders. You must destroy the enemy wherever you see him. When one studies the situation as it really was, one can easily imagine how ridiculous all of those communiques must have seemed to the troops. The real military men listened to the frightened reports as they came in. The invasion was brilliantly planned. It was a well-executed and well-organized military maneuver carried out by the best-trained and best-equipped troops in the world. As my father told me on the train, there were indeed saboteurs putting down landmines even before the paratroopers landed behind the Red Army lines. Air raids had destroyed supply depots and communication centers. There were 11 Red Army divisions in our area, enough, one would think, to repel any attack. But they were put into such disarray by the ferocity of the initial assault that many joined the civilians fleeing into the forests. The Nazi Panzer Division simply swept right by them. Communications were so bad that the high command in Minsk had to guess at what was happening in some very strategic areas. I wish that I knew another word for the so overworked word, hero. A word above that, so I could describe the gallant Soviet soldiers who fought the enemy before he reached Minsk. Those brave soldiers fought on instinct alone to protect their homeland. They gave their lives by the thousands, knowing that they had to slow the enemy down so that civilians could be evacuated and the Red Army could regroup. It was on the night of the 24th that I heard my father's name mentioned in one of the meetings. I held my breath so that I would not miss a word. They said that he was moving toward Polotsk and into the deep woods. His orders were to organize the scattered soldiers and civilians in that area into a unit that would harass the enemy. He was ordered to also help the regular army soldiers to be integrated into the new companies that were moving into Smolensk. A plan was beginning to take shape, although things still looked bleak. To bolster their own morale, most of the officers accepted the theory that my father had given me earlier. They believed that Stalin knew the invasion was coming and that he planned the same fate for them that Napoleon's soldiers met in Russia. Part of the plan was to snipe at the enemy like wolves as his lines stretched out. Arrangements were being made for my father and others to form partisan units for that purpose. I listened to every word. When I heard that the messenger was being sent to the warehouse with a list of supplies that were to be sent to my father, I ran to find Nadia and told her that I must go with the messenger and travel to my father with the supplies. "No, no," she shouted at me. "We have made arrangements for you to go on with the others. At daybreak, you will be on your way safely to Moscow." When the chance came, I slipped out of the house and down the stairs. I ran all the way to the place near the railroad station, where I knew the supplies were being stored. Men and women were loading and unloading trucks. I had not expected to see such a busy place. Trucks were coming and going in a steady stream. The lights were very dim inside, and outside it was so dark that the truck drivers had to watch the men directing them with dim, red glowing flashlights to keep on the road. If anyone would so much as light a cigarette, one of Nadia's militia women would scold him and make them put it out. Many of the soldiers and working men inside greeted me with scowls, but none of them said anything to me. And when I was questioned, I was told, and when I asked questions, I was told to go home. I heard one of the men who was helping to load explosives and other supplies onto 2 trucks telling the drivers that the road to Krasnoyarsk and Molodenko were very dangerous because Molodenko was a railroad town, and the Nazi planes had hit it twice already. Then he said something that made a very important decision for me. He told the drivers that if they get caught out in the open, that they should try and hide the trucks and abandon them. Better that than to give Truskoff's position away, he said. I knew that my father was to organize partisan groups that would prevent the Nazi from using the rail lines that ran from Grodno, Vilnius, Brest, Minsk, Smolensk, and on to Moscow. I also knew that the trucks would find him. I waited until the drivers started their motors before I parted the canvas of one of them and crawled into it. Fearing that I had been seen, I worked my way as far as I could go and hardly drew a breath until the truck was moving. David, I know exactly what you must be saying. Yes, it might have been a foolish thing to do, but I never regretted it. I was not capable of applying logic to such an illogical situation. I was driven only by the desire to be with someone that was part of my stable life. It was not my age, because many adults at that time were drifting like balloons in the wind. They thought only of survival and slowing down the enemy. Those thoughts melded all minds into one. Peeking out from the side of the canvas opposite the driver's side, I saw many people carrying what they could and headed north. It may be hard to believe, but I fell asleep. As a partisan, I was to learn to sleep whenever the opportunity had come along. I hadn't slept but a few hours all the time I was at the house, and the whine of engines soon had me in a sound sleep. The swearing of the driver who found me awakened me. "Dudak! Stupid!" he shouted at me and slapped me with his cap. "What are you doing here?" He asked that question over and over, never giving me a chance to respond. He called the other driver, who crawled back into the truck and put a light from a small flashlight on my face. "It's a boy," he shouted. "I will be in big trouble if the colonel finds out I have a boy riding on top of all these explosives." I did not know that the colonel was my father. The driver of my truck still held his cap in his hand and repeated his worry again and again. There was silence in the truck for a moment before the 2 drivers backed out and had a conference by the side of the road. I waited until they told me to come out. It was just as the birds were about to greet a new day, and we could not see each other too well. The light that we used in the truck could not be lit outside. We were somewhere deep in the woods northeast of Minsk. Finally, one of the drivers controlled his temper long enough to ask me my name and where I was from. When I told him, he tore off his cap again, but this time, instead of slapping me with it, he banged it against his own thigh. He stomped away from the truck and then turned and came back quickly, putting his face right in front of mine. "You make sure that you tell the colonel that we knew nothing of you hiding in that truck. I don't know how you got in there." Of course I promised, and we set out about covering the trucks with brush and tree limbs before starting off into the woods. We walked quietly for about 2 kilometers while the sky began to bring a misty light into the trees. Suddenly, 2 machine-gun-carrying men, who seemed to pop right out of the ground, challenged us. They wore summer shirts and looked just like the men of our young pioneer group. They escorted us into the camp and made us stand outside the tent when they went in to wake the colonel. When the eyes of Nikolaya set on mine, he rushed to me and kissed me, but he quickly regained his composure and turned blazing eyes on the men who had brought me there. I told him about the air raid on the train and how I hid in the truck without the men knowing. He fought back his own tears even when he saw mine, and spoke not to me but to the others who had gathered to see what was going on. He will get some rest and food and leave with the Jews after dark. He turned away from me and gave orders to the group of men to go and unload the trucks. I didn't see my father again until I finished cleaning the pots that were used for dinner that evening. He took me a short ways away from the camp and talked to me about the invasion. He had already heard stories about the atrocities being committed. There were many people using the woods for cover and trying to escape the rapidly advancing Nazi army. The 2 families of Jews that were supposed to take me with them on their journey to Smolensk left at dusk without me. I did not want to go, and Nikolaya did not force me to. There were other Jewish families in the camp. They were found hiding in the woods, not knowing which direction to go in. They were all from the area of Ratomka. They had heard from other Jews about the Nazis, and when the word of the invasion reached them, they closed their shops and fled into the woods. At first they tried to reach Smolensk, but Soviet soldiers warned them about the planes that were strafing the roads, and they went into the woods and lost their way. My father told them they could join the group if they would wear the clothes that they were given and to shave off their beards. They had to eat only the food that we had to keep up their strength. Much of it was pork. They refused, telling my father that they would not be almost Jews. They left the next night. Later, other Jews did join our group. One of my father's captains was a Jew from Minsk, and he and my father were old friends and political allies. Before we walked back into the camp, my father took my hand and talked to me about the family. He told me about how Gregoria used to take him and his brothers hunting in the woods, and that the 3 brothers learned how to use a rifle at a very early age. He apologized for spending so much of his time away from home and not spending that time with me and teaching me. Then, looking down at his boots, he said that we must always have hope and that we will always be together at the new collectivized farm someday. David, there are many hazy periods about the war, things that my mind does not want to remember. But those first few months I can recall so clearly. I do not wish to write about only the war. Enough has been written. I have scores of books about the war, some just romanticized novels that have little relationship with the truth. Even some of the more scholarly works tend to put the facts in bent, surrealistic terms that make the entire ghoulish nightmare sort of bloodless. I have seen Soviet and American films about the war, and they all do the same thing. There's only so far that one can go to describe the horror without being obscene, and so we all tend to put it into glorious colors. It is not just one thing that made my father decide to allow me to stay in the camp, but a series of things. He was very busy, and the Nazi advance was so rapid that no one knew where it was safe to travel. I often wondered if those who left for Smolensk ever got there. We never heard from them again, and if they did get there, we never knew what happened to them when the Nazis arrived. Those first few days, or even weeks, communications with other forces was dangerous and infrequent. Once Minsk was taken, our supply line was cut off. The trucks that I had come in were the last to reach until the offensive began the following year. We had to kill and steal in order to survive, and sometimes that meant stealing from our own villages and farms when the people there refused to help. We saw hoarders as enemies. Again, I must pause to allow history to catch up. The city of Minsk was not accustomed to seeing invaders. Over the centuries, the inhabitants learned the art of survival. If you mix in all the different languages, religions, and old superstitions, and the fact that Belarusia contained the largest concentration of Jews in the world, you can get some kind of an idea of the strategy problem facing the military and my father as he planned the tactics for the rest of the war. From June of 41 until April of 42, it was one long, interscene day after the other, and the days were all attached. It was not like working during the day and going home to sleep at night. You slept when you could, whenever the enemy allowed you to. You ate when you had food, and you thought about nothing but the war, because existing in that environment prevented all other thoughts. We went on raids at night and during the day. Our enemies seemed to be everywhere. There were still those, few in number, but enough to be troublesome, who wanted to form their own independent state, free from communism, and with the church back in control of their lives. The nationalists welcomed Hitler's troops. Many of them joined the Nazis and became their chief informers. They set out to cleanse Byelorussia of Jews. They were the butchers of millions, of Poles, Jews, and Byelorussians. My father used to shake his head and say, "The dog's religion makes the devil dance with joy." And I'm going to end for today. We're halfway through the chapter, so I will continue with the second half of chapter 5 tomorrow. Thank you very much.